As mentioned in previous videos, I've had some nightmare scenarios with certain tenants that lived in my property. This can always happen regardless of the situation, but a highly experienced agency are far less likely to put such tenants in your house. I do know someone who has more than 40 of his own properties, and during COVID he did not have a problem with single tenants because he placed exactly the right tenants in the property. You can do all the checks necessary and place tenants in properties, but if you don't know what their personality is like or how they deal with certain situations, you can still get in trouble. So it's good to meet them and vet them and see what tenants are like before placing them in property, and this is always better to give to a professional agency to deal with rather than you having to fork out the time to do this yourself. I've had other tenants who were students, they were from abroad, and because of this in certain cases they can pay the whole year of rent up front. I've heard this is due to the fact that they can't get credit checks or guarantors or something like that, but basically it's a system some tenants use and it can be very beneficial in that you get all the money up front. But certain tenants can abuse this because they know they've paid their rent. They start to think they can do whatever they want in the property, in particular if the property is not managed or checked. So they know no one's going to come to check. They will not be pestered for rent because they've already paid the rent. So I had a property where the students, they were not particularly violent or argumentative, but I started hearing from the neighbours that things like cars were being parked in front of their neighbouring driveways. There were too many cars in their driveway. There was noise. Windows and doors were being left open. And when such things are done, in particular in student areas, this can be particularly problematic because a lot of criminals know that students don't lock their front doors, which makes them a more viable target, and they're often subject to being burgled more readily than standard tenants would be. So what was happening throughout the year was that windows were being left open, there was noise disruption. I did go to see the property and noticed the condition of the property internally was not ideal. It was quite messy and things were not being looked after. I did warn the tenants that they needed to clear up. They said they would, but you could tell from their demeanour that they didn't really mean what they were doing. The weeks and months passed and things just kept getting worse and worse. I went around again and noticed there were ants crawling inside the house. I don't really know how people live in those kinds of conditions, but it was obvious that hygiene was not a priority for them. They also had a pet cat, which although was not entirely destructive to the property, it was not in the contract. And professional agency would do things like potentially even go on their Facebook and Instagram and see what they're really doing. I did that in this case and saw that in multiple photos there were cats in my property, so potentially this could be used in evidence against them. I didn't quite go that far though. What happened due to the low hygiene standards were that rats were seen by neighbours in the garden. This was reported to the council and the council started to give me warnings. I again had to go there to warn the tenants, and this was towards the end of the year. So they were about to move out anyway. I was careful not to be aggressive or argumentative. I gave them prior notice, so you do have to legally give tenants notice before you turn up. And you cannot do things like, if they do not obey, then change their locks. I understand landlords have been fined over £50,000 for things like this. So you have to be very careful, especially these days, as many of the regulations are in favour of the tenants. So I once again warned them. They said they would clear up, but they didn't. But then tenants moved out within a few weeks, and the property was in quite a shocking condition. They left with the windows wide open, all the lights on. They were probably doing this just to be difficult and rebellious and disrespectful to the property. Maybe it was their form of protest. Everything in the property I provided was fine. It was all fully furnished. It was just their manner was quite abrasive and less than ideal. The agency who placed these tenants often gave me tenants that were quite good and respectful of the property. It's just these happened to be an anomaly. Other tenants were messy, but not quite as messy as these. The garden was fully overgrown. The shed was even a bit broken. I think this happened during the time where the laws were changing and you could charge tenants less for certain damages, but it still remained the fact that the tenants have to return the property to the landlord in the same condition as they took it. I negotiated this with the agency, and in the end the agency either forced them to pay or paid for themselves to rectify the damages. I asked the agent, and eventually he told me that if he had not paid for the damages himself, he would not hear the end of it. So I believe this is what happened in the end. It was a bit of a precarious situation, but it was resolved. But again, it's a learning experience. I think after this I didn't use the same agency again and moved more to the agency who manages and knows Coventry very well and has much more experience with tenants, and I used that agency to then start to move away from the student market and placed more professionals and families in my properties, and I didn't see this kind of problem again. Thanks again. See you in the next video.